Not with hardware. Oh, you thought this thing was going to be the Pi killer? No, well, at least not at $140. This is a pretty cool little computer, and I'll get to it in a minute. But I do a lot of single board computer projects, and one company always dominates. That company, of course, is Raspberry Pi. People ask why I don't cover other single board computers. Well, I actually do. I've spent over 1,000 hours testing SBCs that aren't Raspberry Pis, and I do an occasional video on other SBCs when I think they have something special to offer. Even for this video, I spent over 10 hours testing this little module, the LattePanda Mu. For each SBC, I detail everything I learn over on GitHub. But here's the problem. Well, actually a couple problems. Hardware, performance, thermals, efficiency, those matter to a degree. Like the Intel N100 CPU on here eats the Raspberry Pi for lunch, then mops it up with its built-in GPU. And take the Radsa Rock 5C. Its ARM CPU also beats the Pi, and it's actually cheaper than the Pi. But if any other SBC maker actually wants to beat Raspberry Pi, if they want to sell millions of these instead of thousands, it's actually not that complicated. It's hard, but it's not complicated. And it comes down to one word: value. This is going to be super cheesy, but I think of SBC value in a triangle. It's not like the iron triangle, though, where you can only pick two. I have a triangle where there's cost, performance, and support. The Raspberry Pi 4 absolutely nailed all three. It had good performance, a low price to match, and support has been unparalleled, both from Raspberry Pi supporting Linux on it to tons and tons of third parties building around the Pi 4 and Compute Module 4. The Pi 5, well, the base price went up, and I think it doesn't scale with performance the way Raspberry Pi wishes it would. I think $40 or maybe $45 is the ideal price for a Pi 5. Right now, the base price for this one is $60. It doesn't matter that it's 2.5 times faster than Pi 4. There's something about that price point I think would stick better. I mean, it still sells like hotcakes, and that's because the support and thus the overall value is still so good in the Pi hardware ecosystem. But this price creates a huge opening. Other SBCs could swoop in and take over Raspberry Pi's dominance, especially if they're cheaper. But what does that have to do with this thing? $140 certainly ain't cheap. It is slightly cheaper than the Turing RK1, so maybe if I can find a 4-node carrier board, I can crown a new SBC cluster king. But the Mu has another trick up its sleeve. It all comes down to this chip, the Intel CPU. It's x86. The Pi and all the Rockchip boards are ARM. ARM is a different architecture than x86, meaning some things have to be tweaked or changed between the two. Like Windows runs on ARM, but Windows on ARM is a lot less mature than Windows on x86. I covered that in a few videos on my giant Ampere workstation. Right now, even after a decade or so covering ARM stuff, life is admittedly a little easier on x86. And this little chip gives you all that compatibility right out of the box. No emulation, a huge library of games and apps that just run. No need to build your own containers when someone doesn't maintain an ARM build. That's the big difference. And sure, this thing costs $140 just for this little compute module, but it is twice as fast as the Pi 5, and 5 times faster building the Linux kernel, and I'm kind of a sucker for that benchmark. Twice as fast, less than twice as expensive, and fully compatible with everything x86 over almost 50 years. And Intel's gotten a lot better on efficiency. This thing's not as efficient as the best ARM chips, but it's getting close to the Pi 5. So why does all that matter? Well, if you look back at my cheesy value triangle, you're hitting close on price and performance, at least if you keep scaling those two up to double the Pi 5. The big question I have, and in fact most people making actual projects and products that use these things, is where's the support? I haven't used too many LattePanda products, but the hardware's always pretty good. Same goes for Radsa, Libre Computer, and some of the others. I did have one problem in my testing. I put in a few different NVMe SSDs in this slot, but none of them showed up. I had to email LattePanda and they told me I could reset the BIOS to fix it. Now, their instructions told me to flash it with AFU WinGUI, and they said it was because of PCIe ref clocks and stuff like that. So sure, I can figure those things out, just like I can sort out Rockchip's tools for ARM firmware, at least usually. I still have these brand new Radsa CM3s I've never been able to boot. But looking over to the LattePanda Mu development status page, it's obvious that LattePanda suffers from the same problems a lot of ARM board makers do. The hardware is way ahead of the software. Raspberry Pi might have a feature or two that's not 100% ready to go when they launch a new board, like the PTP timestamp support on the Compute Module 4 took a couple years. But that's not one of the main features. There are so many times now when I'll buy one of these boards at retail, usually a few weeks to a month or two after launch. I'll get it here, I'll start testing it, and right away I run into problems like HDMI doesn't work, or it only works with certain types of monitors, or USB 3 doesn't work, but USB 2 does. Or in this case, the M.2 slot didn't work right out of the box. Now, I do forgive board makers for the issues because firmware is hard. Like, it's actually really hard to write good firmware. But all the times I run into these issues, I'm reminded why Raspberry Pi came into this space and has been so dominant for more than a decade. Instead of having to be a Linux kernel wizard and understand firmware and EEPROMs, 99% of people who buy a Raspberry Pi just want to build a plant monitor, or a little robot controller, or a tiny music player. And if they have problems, there's documentation and easily searchable forums to help. Plus, the Pi firmware and Linux teams spend countless hours making even decade-old Pi interfaces work well with every version of Pi OS. That's the value of a Raspberry Pi. Sure, there are bugs, just like anywhere, but the value is knowing that most of the time, no matter what Pi you have, things will just work. You don't need to monitor a Discord or check on whether something you want to use is going to get supported. You don't have to follow Linux patches or switch Linux distros just to use certain hardware features that are advertised right on the box. You just buy the thing, build a project with it, or put it in your jar and hope to someday, and you're done. But I said I'd give you a rundown on the LattePanda Mu, and that's what I'll do. Because sometimes you can live with little issues if the hardware is just that good. And in this case, the hardware is that good, at least as far as SBCs go. This little compute module, or SOM, System on Module, has an Intel N100 SoC. The N100 has 4 cores that boost to 3.4 GHz and an integrated Intel UHD GPU. My favorite thing is it has 9 lanes of PCI Express Gen 3 expansion, USB 3.2, SATA, HDMI, and a DisplayPort support. It's a lot of expansion for one tiny chip. There's also 8 gigs of LPDDR5 RAM and 64 gigs of eMMC, though the eMMC isn't all that fast. Overall, the Mu performs more like a low-end desktop PC than a single-board computer. And efficiency is pretty good too. I got 2.5 gigaflops per watt running LinPack, which is only a little less than the 2.75 gigaflops per watt on the Pi 5. That doesn't even come close to the most efficient ARM chips like 5 gigaflops per watt on this guy, but it just shows how much Intel's changed course, not just focusing on burning up power to get higher clocks. Now, being a compute module, you can't just plug things straight into it. You need a carrier board, and LattePanda has a couple of those out of the gate. The one I have is a more basic version with some M.2 slots, USB, HDMI, and this open-ended PCIe slot that ETA Prime used to run a full-size GPU for gaming and Windows. It has a few exposed interfaces, but doesn't have the normal 40-pin GPIO header you see on most other SBCs. But it's a solid package. With the fan heatsink, I can run at full blast all day long, though it does get a little loud. If you're willing to underclock it, you can just use a passive aluminum heatsink. Besides a little trouble I had with the BIOS, this thing works just like a regular PC. I could install Windows or any flavor of Linux out of the box. I didn't have to flash any custom ISOs or spend time twiddling with device trees like I do on a lot of Pi clones. But even with the little issues I had, one thing I love about LattePanda is they have a pretty open development process. Their BIOS, schematics, and all that stuff is up in this GitHub repository. Their forum is a little barren, but at least they have one. This Mu has a lot of promise. The hardware's pretty much there. Building out a new compute module standard to fight against the CM4 and upcoming CM5, though, is going to be a lot of work. And on the ARM side, there are already hundreds of compute module boards. Right now for LattePanda, there are only a couple. The Mu has a boost from being x86, but the big question, just like all the other SBCs I test, is this. Will support rise up to match the hardware, or will it end up just another memory in a sea of SBCs? If you want to destroy Raspberry Pi, it takes more than just hardware. A lot more. Until next time, I'm Jeff Geerling.